That was a long 30 seconds. Well, awesome. Well, we are back again for another Pay Practitioners panel. We are excited to be here. Happy day after Halloween, everybody. I don't know if you are hungover from sugar or other things, but we are super happy for everyone to be here talking about something that's kind of scary for most of us comp practitioners, and that is the end of year process. So today we've got a number of compensation consultants. I'll go around the room if it's your first time to join us, but we've got Cassandra Ferraut, Denise Liebtraum, Bobby Berkowitz, James C. Chern, Rekha Garani, Bob Cartwright, and Laura Morgan. And everyone here is a compensation consultant or practitioner or both. And we are here today to get started talking about the merit process and all things about it. So horror stories, good things, best practices, worst practices. I'll start off with a quick horror story and see if anyone else can relate to this. Several years ago, I was working for a tech company, and we had gone through a RIF earlier that year, probably 2 or 3 months prior. We weren't hitting our financial targets. The business was losing money, so we had to adjust the organization. And we laid off about 25% of the organization. And when we went through our merit cycle and submitted that up to the CEO for approval, we were told we have to start over. There were too many four performers, too many high performers. And the question was, how can we have so many high performers if we're not hitting our numbers? That doesn't make sense. So it was an interesting challenge. I think we worked till 3 a.m. over the weekend, most evenings, to come up with something that was solved. That was my biggest horror story. And one of the ways that we learned that we could kind of work around that was communicating more effectively with the CEO and other top leadership before we started that process. Curious, what other horror stories does anybody else have?
I've lived through something similar. We changed things where we did the performance ratings and then calibration on those to make sure that they were aligned before we ever opened up the software or Excel files to do the merit increases, so that we didn't get caught up in that again. So do one before the other is instead of at the same time is one approach I've seen done.
Like yourself, Denise and Justin, similar deal back in corporate life. We went through a major downsizing, and as the stuff came out for the following year, the CEO caught wind of somebody he didn't like that thought he was way overrated and thought the guy kept pumping him up for a reason. So he decided, instead of utilizing the information that was provided, we were going to go through a corporate-wide force rank before the end of the year to execute the pay strategy. And that got really interesting, up to and including people getting fired in the meeting because they were being stupid enough to try to keep pushing their best friend through the process instead of actually doing the things necessary to make sure that people got paid right. So it was a long year.
How about, I have one. Can you guys hear me? I've been having trouble.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Back in my pharma days, there was one learning that I did where I didn't know when you say 3% on a salary, that could be a different end result based off your rounding. And so I had the luxury of the Braille method learning moment where the CFO saw a number and I had a number, and it became locked. Who's going to win the number? So we all had to come to an agreement. Okay, we're going to truncate after 4 and round to 2. And that got to a standardization that I didn't ever think I needed to worry about until the buzzsaw moment.
Wow.
I have one. We had one event where we had decided, first-line managers are going to own the merit decisions. We allocated the budgets down to that level. We put that into our system. We communicated it to managers, had all the enablement sessions, all of that. And then a day before launch, the executive leadership team decided they didn't trust the managers to make those decisions, or they just didn't feel comfortable with it. And so last minute, pull the whole thing out, redid all the budgets, communicated everything all over again, had to relaunch the whole process in the system, and everything else that comes with that. So that was a fun few late nights and weekends.
Wow. Similar one to that as well. Of everything was being done in Workday, and there was trainings, there were videos of how it works, there was the delegation to budgets and everything, and one of the second level leaders had allocated everything out within the Workday system appropriately. It was for the biggest business unit in the organization. And as we were going to finalize it, the leader was like, wait, no, I've done this already in my own spreadsheet. And it was materially different numbers and tie-outs and a calibration session between 1 and 5 a.m. so that it could still go live that next day at 8 a.m. So, yes, hear you on that one, Rekha.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't have a horror story, but just based on what Bob was saying a minute ago, it reminded me of a horror book, which is Straight from the Gut by Jack Welch. And Jack Welch is a familiar name. He was the proponent of this kind of rank and yank forced ranking system where you promote the top 20, sack your bottom 10. So it's not, I mean, it's maybe a horror book for comp consultants, but you just made me think of that, Bob, when you mentioned that system and how much stress it induces through an organization. Very much gone out of fashion.
That CEO had read the book and thought, oh, this would be a great idea. And our friends down the street are doing it too. So we're going to do it too. Yeah. And we had just downsized from 12,000 to 2,500 in 9 months. And so given that premise, we took those 2,500 and went through the buzzsaw in terms of the force rank.
Wow.
And everybody else was being really sensitive at that time across the board because we had 5 operating group units and their employees and their HR leaders and all that good stuff. So it was like a nightmare trying to get them to play because nobody agreed to the process except the CEO. So it didn't matter. So we did it. And,
that's a really interesting thing as I'm thinking about, especially in today's climate, like having a merit cycle right after a downsizing, because there's so much of that happening. Because that's a tricky situation to be in, because arguably if you've gone down that much, you've really retained arguably your top performers. Obviously there's other business rationale that goes into, unfortunately whose roles are eliminated, but arguably you keep your best talent. And then also the morale is exceptionally low right after that. So like, how do you then have a distribution even within that limited group? That's a tricky one. I wonder if other people are dealing with that and how they're doing that.
You had a great point, Rocka. And I think part of that is that when he saw that guy on the list, at the top of the list for that one operating group vice president, he knew that dude had picked people that weren't top performers in his operating group, and that's what sent him over the hump and decided that this thing wasn't working effectively. And so at the end of the day, that dude was found to be not a team leader, the one who he had picked. He disappeared and his boss disappeared within a matter of weeks because he was not shown to be a good team player or business manager. So it was an interesting process. It actually, the nightmare was there, but it actually worked. I was shocked. They really did get the cream of the crop in terms of the execution. And we went from a $250 million company that we had downsized from over $1 billion to over $1 billion company in 4 years. So the people and talent that was left over actually executed the game plan once it was all said and done. Wow. So it was interesting.
There are a lot of success stories, right? Like in Straight from the Gut, I think of General Electric that Jack Welch did this for, and it had an incredible period of growth. I think with anything like this, like in theory, I love it because you're constantly gaining good talent, pushing forward the best talent, removing lower performing talent. In practice, the problem has always been identifying the good and bad talent and not turning it into a favorites contest. And so much of it in practice just turns into like which manager is best at advocating for their group of people, or can just shout the loudest. And obviously an inherent bias just enters into that process at every junction as well, which isn't really great for pay equity and career equity and things like that. And so I do like it in principle. I just in execution, I think a lot of the time it just tends to go around.
And in execution, what I've seen consistently is also a a lack of backbone or courage to have difficult conversations and really have the conversations that say, you know, you view yourself as a high performer, but I view you as more of a meets expectations performer, and here's what you need to do to become a high performer in my eyes consistently over the performance period. It's the difficult conversations that are often avoided, right?
Yeah.
That cause the execution of pay for performance to not land.
Yeah, and I know Denise, you share this view as well. Like this absence of training, because this is a muscle.
Yes.
This is a muscle to be able to deliver this, and after a while, it just becomes natural. It's just a statement of fact. It's completely dispassionate. It's completely impersonal, and it's something that needs to happen to ensure everyone's success in the and the, you know, everyone else's success of the company. And then the amount of managers are just so poorly prepared for that, which I kind of point towards the company. Like it's like anyone can be trained in this. It's just a muscle that needs to be exercised. You need to give people a safe space to do that.
And I think the other piece that often is missed, it shouldn't be a surprise when you're having the annual conversation, right? Like you should have continuous feedback. I'm seeing some head shakes, right? Like it shouldn't be a surprise by the time you get to that point in the year. You should have been having these conversations and this dialogue throughout the year, so there's no surposes.
Do you feel that is? I'm usually in the chat, so I usually have more fun with this. So, so excuse me for jumping in, but what about going down the performance piece and conversations? I had the luxury of working for a pretty new pharma startup, fantastic. It's now what, $58 billion, however big ticket is these days. But at the time, we really focused on self-awareness in order for that the performance conversation to be effective. So we started out with the self, like how well do you know you? And I worry that everybody worries about the manager and the parent to child relationship instead of the adult to adult conversation. And it would be better if the culture of the environment was a safe environment. Like, hey, I'm really struggling with X, Y, or Z. I really know I got to ace my game and I'm struggling with it, and actually have that be the opportunity to help the manager have those conversations. So I think it goes a little bit deeper. And then also having the wherewithal to identify those individuals that are curious, self-driven, self-aware intent, more so than, okay, you're going to be an exceptional rated person, whatever. That just never rolled. Even though I have a merit tool, Neil will kill me for saying that, but sometimes having performance increases and stuff like that has always been my, you guys know that my husband built that tool. So to get me out of spreadsheets, by the way. So that's why. So if you didn't know that, that's the backstory. I was doing merit spreadsheets for my clients and my husband sold his company. I said, you're not done yet. Get me the hell out of these spreadsheets. So that's literally the story. But that being said, I found that doing this, guys, at 38 years, how old I am, you start seeing patterns, and it really starts with that self-awareness.
Yep. Good point.
And I think more and more of those conversations are kind of being forced upon companies to be having with employees, because pay transparency is forcing employees to say, why am I paid below the range or towards the bottom of the range? Because it's out there. And so even if managers want to be afraid to have those conversations and shy away, they're put in the limelight. And so I think, to James, your point around that upfront training is really critical, so that they're not caught off guard so consistently that we're seeing at a lot of our clients. And then I think one other point that we're seeing just in this cost takeout or cost control atmosphere is a lot of clients are looking at re-leveling and putting more integrity to their job architecture. And with that, there's leveling, which are essentially demotions, but not necessarily cutting their pay, but cutting what their merit increase may look like going forward, because they're now positioned above their range based on the recalibration of the levels, which again forces a conversation of like, I've been used to these kinds of merit increases. What's going on here? Is it a company thing? Is it a me thing? And I saw this job description, etc. So more and more we are seeing these conversations happen, whether the managers are ready or want to have them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Pay transparency.
James, go ahead.
Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
All I was going to say is I'm wondering somewhere down the trail if anybody's going to jump on the leveling process and look for some disparate impact or implied bias in how people get leveled, and then who's being leveled to get to that process. There's getting to be a lot more smart plaintiff attorneys out there that are looking for raw meat to go after, and I'm wondering somewhere down the trail if that leveling process is going to be part of that game plan for them.
So, you know what, something that Justin and I were speaking about recently was whether we're going to see this comeback of point factor methodology. I can't remember if we chatted on this call before about this, but point factor remains popular in many parts of the world. And I've heard many people, my colleagues in England, that say, like, we need to do point factors. It's legally defensible as a record, as a scoring system, and we can look at that and point to it at the process. And you could argue whether it is or isn't, or it's just writing down what happens in a career level kind of framework anyway. But what's the view in the room? Are we going to see a return to point factor or some kind of more systematic method of leveling employees and roles? Anyone think there's going to be changes there?
If everybody remembers a highlighter, we used to highlight the scope chart. That used to be the way to do it.
Yes.
So if you at least have a scope chart and you follow the scope, that should be your leveling. So I think what we're having is that title matching issue. Everybody wants to, that is, a risk. That's what most of the clients, we could tell that we walk in, we're like, it's not feeling right, is it? So it's not the Cinderella slipper that you're looking for. You bought that fancy tool and now it's not fitting. So let's help understand why. Oh, so that manager of accounting, what kind of manager of accounting? Oh, did that person, let's start with the simple one. Is it leading people? How many people? All the non-exempt accounts payable people. Well, that may not be an accounting manager, right?
Right.
So I think, going to your point, I think what I'm hearing is scope. If we could all remember, scope drives the end of anything. It's also the performance conversation. If you're not living up to the scope of the job, I had a client that I had to talk to the director of security, quote unquote, director of security. And I said, how often do you hear that you're exceeding expectations? And I said, what do you think my team is listening for? They're not looking at your performance. We're looking at what the expectation was. So are you hearing it over and over and over? You're exceeding expectations? Well, you're here. The job is here. So I'm sizing this. And he's just like, oh my God, I never looked at it that way before. I said, whatever scope and expectations, take advantage of what's in your JD. So,
and I think we're hearing more and more with the pay equity around going into that next level of equal pay for work of equal value. I think that's how we're thinking about it. So for that, like coming back to what you were saying, James, and the point factor system and everything would be sort of the way to get to that way of thinking about equity, right? So I know we used to do that a long time ago, right? And it kind of went away. But I think that's, to your point, the most legally defensible way to like pay equity and pay transparency. But
my experience though with point factor systems is managers learn how to gain them just as fast as they do anything else.
That's exactly.
And so majority of our clients have all moved to just market benchmarking, right? Let's just see where is the market and let's be sure we pay appropriate to the market, because, and we all know how many of those, the IT roles didn't fit, so many of them didn't fit. And then you'd have to move them based on fit to the market versus point factor fit. I am not a fan of point factor systems, in case you haven't figured that out by now. So I hope they don't come back.
The only time I've liked point factor systems is when I've been pricing jobs in countries other than like the US or Canada, where we have really robust market data sources. And when you have countries where you don't have a whole lot of data sources and you kind of have to, interpolate a little bit, point factor can be incredibly helpful in being, in conversations with leaders and how you arrived at a market value reference point for a job. But I'm in agreement. You can game in either approach if you want to.
Yeah. I have a question for the group in terms of assessing, and Laura, I think you've hit something here in terms of scope, is that the mantra that I've always heard from a number of different CEOs I work with over the years is value and contribution. And what's the value of that job, and what's that job contributing to the business? Mm-hmm. And then assessing it from there, looking at it, whether it be job evaluation or job to job comparative analysis or whatever. Sometimes job evaluation is expensive. So how do you cut to the chase in terms of figuring out where that job fits in the organization? And oftentimes people will tell you, just because of they've been there for a while, or this is the way they want it to be, or whatever. But that value, how much do you guys run into people talking about value and contribution?
Well, that goes back to the point factor. The best thing about value was, okay, hey, assessed knowledge, then problem solving, and then the impact on the business. Then Towers, I think, came out and said, let's do the size, or Mercer, let's do the size of the business and then see how much knowledge and requirements you have. So you had right there a break. But what you're getting to is the value. What is that role's really ultimate impact and expectation of the impact on the business?
Yep.
And so you could do point factor one way or the other, but you got to come down to, is it even as simple? Is it regional, domestic? Is it global? I love the idea that everybody, because they have the global title, think that they're actually contributing on a global level. And I have to correct them often, like at best, maybe international. So maybe regional, but I'm not seeing it. So, and that's some of that value, which is easy for us, I think, to say, because we could see it to the root of the job. And we're not trying to be mean. We're just trying to be clear.
Right.
And when we're adding clarity to that job, that in some way, once we do that, it adds that comfort for that executive or that manager. Like, now I get it. Okay, so let's fix it. Let's make it feel right for you. And that usually just takes that extra effort. But I like your point on value. That's what it all is, I think. Not the external. External, I've seen it change up, down, in and out. We're going to go dips, everything. So it's more of that stability. Coming from a company at Abbott back then, 175 years, they were the stable, right? And there was comfort in that. So the value that you had in that, does everybody know Abbott grades? Everybody knows Abbott's grades if you're in pharma. So they have never changed. So I can tell you that they've been the same grade scale for 50 years, 60 years. So
if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
So I had a question about coming back to performance management, and we all shared like horror stories about merit, and it all comes down to a good performance management system. And we have such a wealth of knowledge here in this group. I'm curious if anybody can share an example of when it's been done really well, because we all know the problems with it, but I'm curious about a system that maybe you've implemented or been part of that's actually worked really well.
I can give an example. So I think so. I've read I've tried to read a lot of the research on pay for performance, but the example I'm thinking about what best was when I was in an accounting firm. So I spent 3 years as an accountant, and I didn't like it that much in accounting, but it worked. The model worked, and the reason it worked was the measures of performance were so transactional and straightforward and clear. It was really about billable hours, and if you bill enough time, that's your proxy for how well someone's doing. As they're getting on projects, they're billing their time and doing it efficiently. And if you're going over budget, that's a performance management piece. Like if you're going over budget, you're doing something wrong. But if you're billing your hours and you're doing things right, then that's what would get you. So it was very binary, and it was very frustrating. It was very, in many ways, but it was very impersonal. But it worked. You got the best people forward, and you could identify it because everyone was completely on the same page. So what I took from that was I didn't like it that much, but it did work. It worked because it was simple and clear and transactional, which tends to be the words that surround a good performance management system. And the other really good example is a sales organization. And sales is very clear. You sell, you do well, you get rewarded. You don't sell, you don't get rewarded. And a lot of people try and do all kinds of other stuff around it. But the bottom line is that as a salesperson, you're the custodian of top line growth for a company. And that's a very, very simple message and should be very simple to measure and reward on. Conversely, I think when it doesn't work well is when you take complex, collaborative, innovative groups of people or individuals where the measures of performance go far beyond anything numerical or transactional. And then then you do have to take a much more lenient view and much more human perspective on what's adding long-term value. And you try and make that into a codified performance management system. And that's where things start to go wrong and people don't like it.
I did experience one organization where they implemented, you set your goals in the first quarter. And for those of us who weren't in sales and, those transactional things that you can quantify performance, we had to write less than meets expectations, and exceeds expectations language for each of our goals at the beginning of the year and agree on them with our leader that we reported to. And then that was utilized at the end of the year and throughout the year if there were, changes or things that needed to be made to those definitions. I will say it was great in theory, but in practice, that is a laborious process. And not everybody's great at documenting those types of performance levels in a robust enough way. So it took a lot of consultative effort on the HR business partners and comp team and talent management to get the leaders to and employees to understand their role in that process.
I got to jump in real quick and say, is performance management a people tool or a business tool? And then the secondary piece of that is how does that utilize or execute in terms of the business either way? And I'll give you an example. And I think many of you probably speak in different spaces. I've asked a group of HR professionals for years, how many love performance appraisal process? And maybe 2 in the whole room of 100 plus will raise their hand and go, I love it. And I say, and then how many supervisors that you work for love your performance appraisal process? And it just gets dead silence in the room. And I think there's a real confusion still between performance appraisal and performance management. To me, performance management's a business tool. It's about how you're driving your business to excellence and what are you trying to accomplish at the end of the day in terms of that. And that means you have to align everybody up from top to bottom and make sure they're aligned and executing the business strategy and then assessing whether or not you accomplish that or not based on your role and what does that role bring to the process and based on your group that you're with and based on the overall business at the end of the day. And I have seen those processes work exponentially well. You could even have a red, yellow, green light again kind of scenario in terms of did you, didn't you, or and the last thing I'd avoid is a performance improvement plan, but that's neither here nor there. The game plan, though, is the fact that you're driving the business. And to me, performance management is driving the business. And then the secondary is how do you line up each role and the people in those roles that you hope are good job fits to execute that business strategy. And I think that's the challenge to me. But
Yeah,
that's, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah, and then James, I think what you were saying in addition to the fact that it's very transactional and it's very easy to see the connection between pay and performance in the sales and billable hours. The other thing also, the reason why that works is because the more billable hours or the more revenue bringing in sales, the pool also gets bigger, right? It's almost like you get a percentage of rewards of what you're bringing in versus non-sales roles and all these other roles where there is the pool size stays the same, it's limited. And then how do you then allocate that limited pool across a group of people based on just what you think their performance is? So that's where the challenge comes in. I've seen a lot of new ways of thinking about it coming in. I can't remember who it was, one of the big consulting firms came up with recently a new performance management way of thinking where you ask those 3 questions. And I don't know if anybody knows this better than I do, so please jump in. Maybe Bobby, you've heard of it, where it's like, if you had to pick one person to go with you if you were to leave the company, who would you take with you, or something like that? That really kind of gets to heart of really picking your top people and forcing you to think and kind of removing a little bit of the bias that typically comes in. I was curious if anybody had an experience with that or any thoughts on that.
I did. We had a system where I helped train a lot of managers, and they moved to a much more simpler rating system instead of 5. I think maybe there were 3. And then in terms of determining merit, you had to determine who were your top performers. And they did limit, a certain percentage of the entire workforce. And that question you mentioned and 1 or 2 others, it was like, yes, if you were leaving tomorrow and you could take 1 person with you, who would it be? If you were going out of the country and you absolutely could not be reached for the next 30 days, who would you leave in charge?
Mm-hmm.
And it was those kind of questions that really, everybody's, above average, right? But it really made them think and narrow it down to 1 or 2 people that they truly could reward at, the top.
So building
the
on
highest
that, though,
they could.
wouldn't the next question be more important, though, is, okay, what is it that made that person so amazing? So that becomes, and then because there are 50 or 60 PDI attributes, things to build and develop. The next question is the most relevant for the rest of you sit with the CEO and you say, all right, those questions, okay, what is it that we can point to that out of all of the 48 attributes, characteristics of a person that we feel that we need now to fill that void? If we're going to fill that void, now that becomes your performance management tool and your performance experience tool. you end up saying, have you ever had exposure to that? You know, do you need exposure? You know, how do I give you the experience? So while that starts out in a real altruistic, helpful for that individual, I'd like it to be then that becomes the conversation of, okay, how do we make this breathe versus that one person?
Yeah,
then
because
you-
we all the behaviors drive the results, right? It's just like the
Right.
salesperson. You can't just measure salespeople only on their results. If they're leaving 25 dead bodies along the way, you're still not
Right.
accomplishing anything, right?
That's exactly
So
right.
I think it's that delicate balance of behaviors versus results is where the challenge comes. And yeah, definitely identifying. I agree with you. Let's identify what's making people successful.
One of the things that I'm hungry for is a shift in how we think about performance. We spend, time talking about, or, metrics for bonus and things like that are like, business unit or corporate metrics and then individual metrics. I think there's a level in there that we don't talk about enough and we don't assess, and that's team performance, right? If you think about how to Bob, your point, performance management is supposed to drive the business. It's supposed to help us execute the business strategy. Then we don't do that in isolation on an island. We do that as teams. And,
Right.
I'd love to see an approach where you could get feedback from others. And obviously you'd have to define the teams and have software to support it, but define the team performance. Are they truly working to deliver are they meeting the expectations of their internal clients and so forth? And that I just don't think gets talked about enough.
Denise, you hit a perfect point, and I'm just going to throw this out real quick. When I worked corporate life, we had a project that we got paid by the government a lot of money. And 6 months down the road, they cannot produce the product with quality. And it happened to be a defense contract scenario to where it was very critical to the government in terms of making a move on the international level. So we had this big powwow, and the CEO and everybody's in there, and a lot of gnashing of teeth and finger pointing and the whole enchilada. And engineering's fault, program management's fault, yada yada yada. Everybody in this room has been there. At the end of the day, CEO turns to me and says, "What would you do? How would you fix this problem, HR?" Have we asked the people on the floor why they can't meet quals? Have we asked them why something is not working right? Well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard my whole life, said everybody in the room, and the CEO goes, "Go ask them." Well, what a lot of people in the room didn't realize is the people we were hiring were getting their masters or PhDs in engineering and everything else, but they were working in manufacturing because we paid probably better than most companies in the city at that point in time. And we had a great bunch of people. So we went and asked them, and within 3 days, we had started producing with quality in the whole enchilada. We took that whole team, measured them in terms of quality, productivity, and rewarded them with $3,500 per individual bonus check, steak dinners, did it 4 times, and they were blowing product out the door. That same product was the one that you had Wolf Blitzer and the others sitting on top of somewhere in the Middle East watching countermeasure systems flying across the sky, and that one plane went down and that was our product, the countermeasure system. So, if you think about it in terms of real time, performance is important in terms of driving a business. And sometimes people get in the way in terms of executing the business, and engineers and program managers were a lot of getting in the way of making that happen until finally somebody saw through and went to go ask the people who were working on the product, and they had the answer. So
don't make
you're right, Denise.
Don't make assumptions. Ask the people doing the work.
Exactly.
And I think, one of the, Rekha, you kind of brought up the different approach with how the questions people are asking, because I think a lot of times, a 1 to 5 scale is rather ambiguous in terms of what is a 3, what's a 4, not just to the employees, but to the managers as well. And I think trying to really suss out what that is, I think it's an interesting approach to ask practical questions that really get to the point of who are your top performers, and then using that to understand and drilling into it further to understand, well, why are they? What are they doing? So I think that really being very clear with what the differences in performance are and what expectations you have of people to reach those, agnostic of the role they're in, is one of the really important pieces that can help those conversations.
Yeah,
I would the employee's job of asking, how am I going to be assessed? So I was that, if my bosses are listening of the past, maybe because I was calm, I said, I'd like to see the performance scale because I want to know how I'm going to be evaluated. And then what do you see as significant? I hated that word. What do you see as significant? What do you see as exceptional? And I feel that that's a brokering of a deal, right? So I got hired. I want to know how I'm going to be evaluated. You hired me. I want to know how you're going to assess me. And I feel that we lost that when we do conversations. That, again, I'm trying to do the adult to adult. We don't hire children, we hire adults. So when we have a parent to child environment, we got to get it to be like, hey, let's make sure in the earlier days we talk through how our performance system works. And I think we wait to the end of the day, and that's why you get the reaction. So I feel that the whole communication structure should be pretty ongoing. And then if you made a mistake, that's a lot easier to say, oh gosh, Art, my old boss, I'm like, I got to see you because I already know how you're going to ding me, but let's talk through it. And it was that kind of environment that I hope we could get to, where everybody looks at it like, I'm hired, I'm giving you my time, you're hiring me, you're giving me my dime. So let's just work it out.
Yeah. I would also say, like, let's not over rotate on like the top end of the spectrum of who are the top performers. And then it ultimately, like in Cassandra, your example where there's only 3, you're going to end up with like 90% of the population in that middle bucket. And if you're just focused on who are the top, who are the bottom, and then everyone else is in the middle, there's a very big difference between the strongest performer in that middle bucket and the lowest performer. And if you're treating them the same, those top performers that are still in the middle bucket because you have a high performance culture, or that's just how you bucket it, they're going to start being disengaged and not understand, like, why is there no differentiation between them and someone who's on the cusp of being a lower performer? So just want to call that caveat, because I do feel like a lot of this conversation is moving of like, let's get the tippy top taken care of and differentiated, and then we forget about kind of everyone else. But there still needs to be a differentiation as you go through that middle performance.
It's the middle guys, Bobby, as you're saying, that actually day to day get the job done. They meet the expectations and get it done. And your performers are the ones that push the organization to go to the next level on certain things, to me. But you're right. That middle part gets lost in the weeds a lot of times because, oh, we got to, we're a performing organization, yada, yada, yada. And half the time, if you ask senior management, what does a performing organization mean to you? They can't define it. Yep. Which is another consulting scenario. Where's your pain? How does it define? And they don't get it. They hear the buzzwords, they read the headlines and run off on it, and then they can't figure out what the heck they're doing at the end of the day, and create chaos, which is exactly why they hire folks like us to go help them with their chaos, right?
There's plenty of work to do. Yeah, they can't describe the behavior and the results they need, then how can you meet the expectation, right?
Right.
Speaking of chaos, I want to ask a question of the group, because I'm a bit of an armchair pundit when it comes to the merit cycle, because I haven't actually had to lead it in an organization. But the horror stories you all told at the beginning around getting to the end of that cycle and then basically getting a curveball, right, and have to just change everything. There are that's a very familiar story, not just from everyone here, but from many of my clients as well. So you get to that point, you've done your rapid model, you know the process, you've got your file, you've got your decisions, you do it all like clockwork, then it gets too late. And then a change comes around and someone says, oh, I need to do it differently. I don't like it. Or the budget's changed. Actually, there's no more room for this. Actually, you need to halve your promotional increases. My question is, do you have any advice for people out there, though, who are inevitably going to get to that point at some stage this year? How do you deal with that when you think you've done everything right, yet things can go so wrong late in the day, and you have to deal with a stakeholder that just wants to change everything despite your best efforts?
That to me is a red flag. If you have changes like that are unexpected, that means you haven't done the change management and the stakeholder work on the front end and had repeated check-ins to make sure nothing's changed in their thinking of the business context that's going to make things move, and reminding them in writing, etc., that this is the decisions that they made and the expectation setting that they made about, how they expect the performance rating curve to come in, or the calibration sessions and consistency in that, and having guiding principles, and then, making the pay decisions. It's all stakeholder and change management. And I don't think we have capabilities in that consistently across firms. I think there's a huge amount of effort put in on metrics and calculations and the tactics of how we're going to do something, but actually having buy-in and context and the stakeholder work done well, that's where you end up in trouble.
James, I asked the question, test the yeses. If somebody agrees to something and you're walking down the path and they continue to agree to it, before you roll out, I learned a long time ago, you go back to each one of them and you go, this is the expectation based on X, Y, and Z. Are you still on board with this? And if so, please confirm in your mind what that means to you, because there's nothing worse than getting to the end and finding out they've been lying to you the whole time because they had no expectation of doing this, and then blindsiding the heck out of you and then blaming you for the problem. And to me, that's just total waste of time. But that's how corporate games get played from time to time. And so from that expectation, you really have to nail them down to be able to come back to them and go, well, on this date, you have agreed to this. So you tell me, and you get, then you got to do the tough conversations, whether it be with him directly or with him and his boss or everybody in the room. What the hell?
The sooner you know, the better, right? If they are going to change the direction, then you'd rather know it sooner rather than on the day before you're supposed to roll out those.
Exactly. And I've had that happen to me twice back in the day, and promised myself it was never going to happen again. Even if I got my, fired, I didn't care, because it's just miserable.
Yeah. I will give you an example, a story. I was in a room where it was about communications and having effective communications. And the person wrote on the whiteboard, most, some, few, and many. And then they said, okay, most, how many is that? Is that, keep your hand up. Is that 2? Is that 3? Is that 4? Same with some, drop your hand once we get, to the number that doesn't fit when you think of the word most. And then do that with words like some, few, many. We have so little clarity on some word choices that we use. You have to get so specific and put it in front of them in a way so that you create common understanding, right? So that was a really eye-opening experience for me when I was in the room and I saw how many different versions and definitions of those words there were in that room that day.
Interesting. And on that note too, there's a couple of questions that I think are related to what we're talking about. I'd like to highlight Michelle's question, asking, has anyone ever had a manager say, I don't give and exceeds expectations, or a 5 out of a 5 as a point of pride? And then how do we make sure that managers are using those? I mean, there's all kinds of funny Instagram reels or little cartoons about, a 5 is a unicorn. Like that doesn't actually exist, but I think it should. How have you guys found it effective means to communicate when it is okay to give a 5?
This relates so closely to what Denise was saying. Like, what does exceeds mean? Like, it's so subjective unless you explain what that is. I think that you have to provide clear, articulate examples, right, of what it means to exceed expectations, and demonstrable stories of people that have, and so that people have something to stack up against, and it needs to be consistent for everyone.
We had a great exercise at Takeda that I recommend, because it was a day of everybody standing up and saying who they thought was, in that case, a 5. So we had a rotation that the head of HR, the CEO, and the CFO sat in a room, and they had to hear the presentation of the respective ratings that were above performance. And then as a recommendation, it wasn't done until the CEO actually the CEO, Ellen was fantastic. He's like, I want to meet them. And so he would actually carve out of his day or a week of meeting with them before it was actually bequeathed that they get. Now, mind you, in Japanese companies, we weren't allowed to use the title of VP until we were $1 billion. But there were a lot of standards that we had to hit. But that added such an elegance to that process that it wasn't just peanut butter, as the name of this meeting is, right? You actually had to stand up and say what you really valued. And then he took that as input forevermore until the next cycle. And then he would be like, okay, I could see why that person is meeting our Takeda values. I can see it and I want to uphold it. So he challenged them, the comp team, me included. All right, go write all that out. And I want that to be in the reviews next year. So anyway, and I've tried to carry that through. It's carrying that governance, I guess, That a lot of, we take it for granted that it's down to the manager. It's actually the leader. And we got to get that leader to uphold it. It's not an HR exercise. We're doing this for the leadership to be able to be successful. So.
And I think what I was saying earlier about asking that questions or questions like that will help solve for both of the problems, right? Like on the one hand, we have managers who give everybody a 5 because everybody's a superstar and everybody's a unicorn, right? And then on the other hand, we have a manager like, for example, the one that Michelle might have encountered who's like, I never give out. These standards are way too high. So when you're forced to ask that question, like who is that one person that you would entrust this if you were out of the office, or who was that one person you would take with you if you were to go start your own company tomorrow? That would really force them to be selective and like giving that exceeds in a way, if needed, right? So I think one conversation is just, are we exceeding the how's everybody performing versus the expectations for their role? But then when you're starting to do those calibrations to really pick out the 10% superstars of the company, I think those kinds of questions will force a manager like this to break his point of pride and like make that choice they had, because they have to pick one person. Who would you pick?
You know what it highlights to me is that this person isn't a good manager. Person doesn't know he's basically coming out with biases of how he thinks life should be versus actually being a steward of the company and the steward of the business and being a leader of the business. And I think part of our role as we go through these processes are help management identify those that we see potentially aren't good people to be in management roles, because guess what? Talent's expensive. And if they sit there and play those kind of games, then what they're going to do is drive people out of the organization, which costs 2 or 3 times what it takes to go hire somebody to come in and go through the same I never give exceeds expectations. So you're just going to be also ran in my company.
I think we hear the opposite more so. Don't we hear the opposite more so, where we hear them saying, I hire everybody that's exceeding expectations?
Right.
That's
I'm the cream of the crop.
That's more of a typical problem, right? Everybody's exceeds. And they're both biases in different ways, right?
Well, speaking of bias, I want to go back to the topic of pay transparency and pay equity, right? We have these pay transparency laws to try to push us in a realm of shining a light on things that are inequitable. And as these laws, both here in the US and globally, are, put in place, and we've lived with them for a few years, we're going to see, I think, some teeth grow and some penalties for companies who aren't doing the right thing. One of the things I'm not seeing consistently is a recognition. Bias exists. Like, we can't get rid of it 100%. Ideally, you build a culture where you can ask questions and say things in a room and shine a light on things that might need some more scrutiny. But when we make performance assessments about potential, we make promotion decisions, all of those decisions and processes to make those decisions or assessments have to be scrutinized to a great deal, because it ultimately ends up impacting pay. And I don't know that we have enough root cause analysis in the pay equity audits. After I get done with that type of work, I find it difficult to get people to want to do the root cause analysis to find out what are the multiple processes or systemic things that they've got going on in their work culture to minimize the inequities.
But I think we got to remember that the reason why I heard the word bias quite a bit here. So I know I'm new on the panel. I'm just counting it. It used to be called opinion, but anyway, here we go. We could have a very crisp evaluation of all performers by one person. What we're doing is delegating that authority with trust that person will understand how that one person interprets pay and interprets performance. And then we continue to bequeath that further. So it could be removed. It could be easily centered back to the level 2 leaders. It could be centered back all the way up if we want that to be absolutely crisp and consistent. But I think we got to be mindful that we need the help and the delegation to those that really know them further down. So we need to make sure that the opinion of that leadership triangle is really embraced and supported and trusted and enabled to carry it throughout. I worry when I keep hearing everybody trying to collect the data down here and take that manager's opinion of what is good performance versus what it should be from a consistency all the way through.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that calibration conversation and making sure that the leadership's viewpoint is filtered through and that everybody has a full understanding of the behavior and results that meets each bucket of performance, whatever you're labeling it, is really critical. I I just think that if it's not crisp to your point in that delegation and in calibration discussions, then that's where we end up running afoul to some of these pay equity focus areas that we've got in certain jurisdictions.
And James, you weren't too far off when you brought up Jack Welch in terms of the execution of that particular strategy. You know, if you think back on it, it was a smart move on his part back in the day. And it depends on the type of management team and culture and leadership team you have tomorrow and today. And I think somewhere down the trail, there's a hybrid that's going to come down the path on some of this stuff related to taking his scenarios and some of the stuff we've talked about today and coming out with a new game plan on how this works. Because Laura, I agree with you. If you don't have some kind of sense of what's going on from here and how that aligns back down and then comes back up to them, where they have to explain their organization and how well they're performing and who's performing and why people get selected, that's where people lose track of, back to you, Denise, in terms of, are they a team player or are they just leaving dead bodies all over the organization, which also gets found out if you bring those leaders together and have that conversation. Then they find out who really is performing in the organization, who's not, or who's pseudo, or who's an imposter. And once you find those, and then you reallocate the dollars to those that are executing and creating value and contribution to the organization. That's a lot of work, though. But somewhere there's got to be some kind of hybrid that comes out that helps make that.
Well, here's
more
one
easy.
extreme. I knew a client, or not a client, sorry. I was at a conference and it was 20 years ago. And I was hosting a roundtable, and behind next to me was a woman that said, I have 400 people and we have 12 salaries. And I'm supposed to be hosting a facilitating conversation. I said, you guys don't want to talk to me. We got to talk to her. So I pulled her over and I said, okay, explain to me. I just heard you have 400 people and 12 salaries. She says, we've removed it. Everybody has a 1 of 12 and you're hired in at that rate, and your new salary is going to be determined for everybody at that rate. So when we have a hybrid, you could go that extreme, right? Having no discernment, no decision making there. And then you could go what we do on the market pricing and be creative over here. What we need to know, the hybrid is kind of where most companies are, I think.
Yeah.
And we got to uphold that, I think, more consistent.
I don't know. I kind of love the idea of ditching salary bands, like, because you can have a range of pay, but for the most part, if you get it right and then everyone understands it, and you get a year-end increase that keeps you competitive, and then you communicate that the way to get more money is to get promoted, and we're going to reward people, and we're going to promote people, and it's just so much clearer and simpler rather than having this sort of plus minus 20% or 40% range. But I just kind of like the idea of it. So I'm kind of pleased to hear there's at least one company out there that's just ditched it entirely. I'm just kind of waiting to see more companies do that. I think it might happen.
I mean, I see some companies getting narrower in their range, to your point. And I mean, very few companies are actually at that like one rate per job, but they are getting narrower with pay transparency.
I think there's ways to defend, discretion and judgment, but it's consistency and written standards and buy-in and understanding that you've got to have with it to make it work well.
Yeah. And I think it depends also on just the organization, not only the culture and the leadership style, but like the size and the complexity of the organization, because what might help work for 400 people isn't going to work for 10 to 20,000 people, or even, 50 people, where you can just spend an hour going through it. So I do think that, there's another blend to that hybrid, Bob. So maybe we spend an hour after this and create a new business line.
I'm all for it. Let's do it. Never a dull moment when you start creating, right?
Yeah.
All right.
You know what? As a thought process, if you think about the amount of money that goes into the performance appraisal process and all the touch points that go into that, and how much bucket that creates at the end of the year. Say if you're talking about 10 or 12,000 employees and all the supervisors and managers that touch that process during the year, and you add up all those dollars and you figure out, is this of value? Because I mean, you look at everything else in terms of product development and innovative thought processes and everything else that goes into a business. At the end of the day, what is of value and what is not of value, and then that's where you start looking at how do you drive the business to excellence. And I can tell you, people spending millions of dollars a year on this performance appraisal versus management process, and it amazes me how much money goes out the door, because at the end of the day, if you take a poll of the people who just got appraised, went through that process, they go, well, that sucked, pardon my French, but you get a lot more negativity out of some of those conversations than you do positivity, because it's not done well.
Yeah. There was a question from Stacy, actually. How can we drive business performance at the same time engage in individual performance? Which kind of just reminded me of some of the early conversations, which is a point I just wanted to come back to, which is this kind of role, not person distinction. And that those words weren't used explicitly, but it reminded me of that phrase, which I learned many years ago from Eddie Tan, the job matching guru at Radford. And it's such an important distinction in so many different parts of everything we do. So this piece, for example, that there's a role, you fit into that role. Your individual performance is your ability to meet or exceed or not meet, rather, the responsibilities of that role. That's your measure of individual performance. It's not about you as a person, how great you are, and how much cool stuff you do. It's about, there's a role for you here, and we need someone to do that role. and that's to me, linking business performance and individual performance is we are solely assessing your ability to do the job that we've put you in. And if you don't think that's the job for you, great. Well, let's have a conversation about career paths. Let's turn it into something positive. Like if you think you can do a better job, let's find an opportunity to test that out and demonstrate those skill sets. And again, come back to people management. And that's where a good manager comes in. It's not like, oh, you're doing a great job, but yeah, I just can't get that promotion. They're saying no this year. Or yeah, I'd love to give you a bigger merit increase, but I'm just not being allowed to. And I said, no, I'm an ambassador for the company. And my job is to make sure you're doing this role correctly. And I've got stewardship over this role. And if you do well in that role, then that's great. And if you don't want to be in that role, let's have a meaningful conversation about a better role for you, or not, as the case may be.
Well articulated. Very well articulated, Jay.
People managers are the glue that makes it work, right? Good people managers. I also sometimes wonder if we've ever rotated on emphasizing kind of financial and numeric, like accounting types of metrics versus metrics that are more people management oriented. I think sometimes we get caught up in the short-term story of which you have to tell investors and key stakeholders, and we don't pay attention or shine a light on some of those human capital, people management kinds of metrics that tell the broader story and drive performance, right?
Well, great. Well, on that note, we are just about at the top of the hour. So again, thank you everybody for taking the time to connect today. Cassandra, Denise, Bobby, James, Reka, Bob, and Laura, thanks for standing in for Sherry. That was a great conversation. Really appreciate the time, and we will see everybody